My mom called me unstable for 7 years. She said it like she was giving a weather report. She said it at family dinners. She said it to my aunts on the phone when she didn't know I was in the next room. She said it so casually for so long that I started to wonder if maybe she was right. Then last March, a package arrived from a lawyer in Ireland, and I sat at my kitchen counter with 86 unopened letters in front of me, and I figured out that my mother had been lying about me to the whole family for 7 years on purpose, because she had needed me to be something I wasn't, so that she could take something that was mine. I want to tell you what was in those letters, but first I want to tell you about the package, because the package is the first thing that made me think, in a long time, that maybe I was not the broken one. The package was small and plain and wrapped in brown paper. The return address was a name I did not recognize, in a town in Ireland I had never heard of. I had been at work that afternoon. I came home and there it was on my kitchen counter, where my landlord had left it after signing for it. I made myself a cup of tea. I sat with it. I almost did not open it that night. Something about the weight of it had told me, before I had even cut it open, that what was inside was going to change my life, and I was not sure I had the energy that evening to be changed. I opened it anyway. Inside was a wooden box, old wood, the kind that has been holding something quiet for a long time. There was a small note taped to the lid, in handwriting I did not recognize, that said, "These belong to you. They have always belonged to you. I am sorry it took us this long. Killian Doyle, solicitor." Inside the box, tied together with a faded green ribbon, were 86 envelopes. Every one of them was sealed. Every one of them was addressed to me, at addresses I had lived at going back 9 years. Every one of them was stamped, in red ink, with the words, "Return to sender, recipient unknown." And underneath the red stamp, in pen, in handwriting I had been seeing on birthday cards my whole life, somebody had written the word "returned" and had initialed it. The handwriting was my mother's. The return address on every single one of those envelopes was the same. A man named Bram O'Sullivan. A house in Galway, Ireland. A street I would have to learn to pronounce. My mother had been intercepting my mail for 9 years. I sat at the counter with the box in front of me for 2 hours. I did not open the letters yet. I did not call anyone. I did not drink the tea. I just sat there, and I thought about how thoroughly I had been taught over those 7 years that I was the broken one, the fragile one, the one the family had to be careful with. And I started to put together, slowly, that the version of me my mother had been selling to my whole family had probably been a lie she had been telling on purpose, for reasons that had nothing to do with me at all. My name is Wren. I am 28 years old. I am a senior software engineer at a small tech company in Boston. The year I was 19, I had a hard 3 months, the hardest of my life. My mother used those 3 months to convince every member of my extended family that I had inherited the mental health history of my biological father, who I had been told my whole life did not want to know me. By the time I was 20, my parents had quietly taken control of the trust fund my grandmother had left me when I was 7. By the time I was 26, most of that trust fund was gone, spent on things they had decided to call family wellness. By the time I was 27, the family had been treating me as the careful one, the watched one, the one who had to be handled, for 7 years. The package from Ireland was the first thing in 7 years that told me the story I had been living inside might not be mine. Before I go further, hit subscribe. And tell me one thing in the comments. Tell me about a label your family put on you in a hard moment of your life that became the only thing they were willing to call you afterward. Tell me how old you were when they named you wrong. Tell me what the word was. Tell me how long you carried it. I read every comment. Now let me take you back to the year I was 19, because that is where the lie started. I want to tell you about my grandmother first. The story does not work without her. Her name was Maeve O'Sullivan. She had been my biological grandmother. She had emigrated from Ireland to Boston in 1962, when she had been 23 years old, with her young husband and a small leather suitcase. She had worked as a nurse for 38 years at a Catholic hospital in Boston. She had raised 2 children. The older one had been her son Bram, who I would not know existed for most of my life. The younger one had been her daughter Saoirse, who had married a man named Eamon Halloran in 1992, and who had become my mother, in the way the family had decided I would understand the word mother, when I had been 2 years old and Saoirse had taken me into her home. I had met my grandmother Maeve only twice in my life. She had stopped coming to family gatherings around the time I had been 4. The story I had been told by my mother was that Maeve had been a difficult woman, and that there had been a falling out, and that the family had decided it was healthier for everybody if Maeve was not invited to family events. I had accepted that story for 26 years, The way you accept the stories your family tells you about people you do not know how to verify. Maeve had died last December. I had not gone to the funeral. My mother had not told me Maeve had died until after the funeral, which had been in Ireland, where Maeve had moved back to in her 70s. I had not asked many questions. I had assumed it was the family pattern. I had been wrong about that, like I had been wrong about almost everything that had been told to me about Maeve and her family for most of my life. The package from Killian Doyle, the solicitor in Galway, arrived 3 months after Maeve's death. The package was, I would learn, the result of Maeve's specific instructions to him in her will. She had instructed him to wait 3 months after her death to send me the wooden box, and she had instructed him to bypass any contact with my mother in the process. She had assumed, correctly, that my mother would attempt to intercept whatever was sent. She had given Killian my work address, which she had obtained through a small Catholic charity in Boston that she had been quietly donating to for decades, and which had been told, by Maeve, to verify my employer's address before she died. She had been planning the delivery of that wooden box for almost 10 years. I want to tell you what was in the rest of the wooden box, beyond the 86 returned letters, because the rest of the contents matter for the story. There was a small leather notebook. The notebook was Maeve's. It contained, in her handwriting, a careful timeline of a story I had not yet known, but which I would spend the next 3 months piecing together. The story began in 1997, the year I had been born, and ended in the month before her death. There was a photograph. The photograph was of a young man in his 20s, standing in front of a small stone house in Ireland. He was holding a baby. The baby was me. I had not seen this photograph before. The young man was wearing a blue sweater. He looked tired. He looked like he had been crying, although he was smiling at the camera. The back of the photograph said, in Maeve's handwriting, "Bram and Wren, the first week, before everything went wrong." There was a small key on a leather cord. There was a piece of paper that explained the key opened a safety deposit box at a bank in Galway. The paper had the bank's address. There were instructions to fly to Galway, to bring the key, and to ask for Killian Doyle, who would meet me at the bank. I want to tell you what I did with the 86 letters before I got on a plane. I did not open them in order. I want to be honest about that. I had assumed I would. I had thought I would carefully begin with the earliest letter and read them chronologically, the way a person who works with code likes to do things. I did not. I sat at my kitchen counter and I picked one at random, from the middle of the stack. I opened the envelope. The envelope had been sealed and unsealed and resealed many times. The handwriting on the letter was the same handwriting from the photograph in the box. The handwriting was Bram's. The letter was 4 pages. It was dated 3 years earlier. It was addressed to me. It began, "Dear Wren, I do not know if you will ever read this. I have been writing to you every birthday since you turned 18, and I have been mailing the letters to the addresses my mother has been able to find for you. The letters keep coming back. I do not know if your address is wrong, or if you are returning them, or if somebody else is returning them. I have decided not to know. The decision is mine to keep writing, regardless of whether you are reading. The reading is yours to decide, eventually. I just have to keep writing. I owe it to you, after everything, to keep being a person who is reaching." I want you to know that I cried at my kitchen counter for about an hour after I read that letter. I did not yet know who Bram was, in any official way. I had assumed, correctly, that he was my biological father. I had grown up knowing I was adopted. I had grown up being told my biological parents were both unfit, that my biological mother had died in childbirth from complications, and that my biological father had had a serious mental health crisis afterward, and had been institutionalized. I had been told my adoptive parents, who were his sister and her husband, had taken me in to keep me in the family. I had been told my biological father had recovered eventually, but had become withdrawn and had moved back to Ireland, and had not wanted contact. I had been told this story so many times, by my adoptive parents, in slightly different versions over the years, that I had stopped questioning it by the time I had been about 10. The letter in my kitchen in front of me was telling me a different version. It was telling me that Bram had been writing me, faithfully, every birthday since I had turned 18. It was telling me he had been doing it without knowing if I had been receiving anything. It was telling me he had been reaching, in the only way he had been allowed to reach, for 9 years. I read the rest of the letters that night. I read them in chronological order, after the first one I had picked at random. I read every single one of the 86. I finished around 4 in the morning. The letters were, taken together, the longest love story I had ever read. They were the letters of a man who had been told, by his sister, that contacting his daughter directly would traumatize her. They were the letters of a man who had agreed, at the time, that he was unfit to be in his daughter's life, because he had believed what his family had been telling him about the long-term effects of his mental health history. They were the letters of a man who had spent 25 years trying to honor an agreement he had made when he had been 25 years old, in the worst year of his life, with people who had taken advantage of how broken he had been at the time. The letters were also the letters of a man who had, around the time he had turned 40, started to question the agreement. He had begun therapy. He had begun, slowly, to understand that the agreement had not been an honest one. He had begun, around year 4 of his therapy, writing me letters anyway, on the calculation that I had become an adult, and that whatever decision I made about him should be a decision I got to make for myself, with information he was finally going to provide. He had been mailing the letters to whatever addresses he could find for me. He had been finding the addresses through public records, through alumni directories, through the school I had attended for a year before I had transferred. He had been getting them all wrong, or so he had assumed. He had been getting them returned to sender, every year, with the same red rubber stamp. What he had not known, for 9 years, was that the addresses had been correct. The letters had been arriving at the homes I had lived in. They had been arriving at my college apartment, at my first sublet, at my first lease in Boston, at my current apartment. My adoptive mother had been intercepting them at every step. She had been getting tipped off, by various family members and friends of the family who had access to my address, every time I had moved. She had been driving by my mailbox during the windows when she knew Bram's letters might arrive. She had been collecting them. She had been writing "returned" on each one in her own handwriting. She had been taking them to a post office and remailing them back to Ireland. She had been doing this for 9 years. I want to tell you about my mother now. I want to be careful about how I do it. Saoirse Halloran was, by every metric, the only mother I had really known. She had taken me in when I had been 2 years old. She had raised me. She had nursed me through every cold and every flu and every broken bone. She had taught me how to cook. She had told me she loved me, and I had believed her, and the love had been, in the small visible ways, real. I want to be honest about that, because the rest of the story does not work if you assume she was a monster from the beginning. She had not been a monster. She had been a woman who had made a series of choices, over 30 years, that had each made the next choice slightly easier to make, until she had ended up in a place where intercepting her own daughter's mail had felt, to her, like a reasonable and even loving thing to do. The first choice had been the choice to take me in, when I had been 2. That choice had been a kind one. Bram had been in a residential treatment facility. The treatment had been long. Saoirse had told her brother, with what I now believe had been genuine love at the time, that she would care for me until he was well. Bram had agreed. He had not been in a position to argue. The arrangement had been informal. There had been no court involvement. The paperwork had been completed later, when Bram had been further along in his recovery, and had not been thinking clearly about the long-term consequences of legal documents. The second choice had been the choice not to give me back, when Bram had stabilized. By then, I had been 4. Saoirse had decided, with what I now believe had been a more complicated mix of feelings, that I had been with her too long to be uprooted. She had told Bram that the disruption would harm me. She had told him she was the only mother I knew. She had cried, she had begged. Bram, who had been 30 by then, had been newly out of treatment, had been working on understanding his own life, and had not had the legal resources to fight her. He had agreed to a trial period in which I would stay with Saoirse and Eamon, with the understanding that he would visit. The visits had been allowed for 2 years. Then they had been quietly discouraged. Then they had stopped. The third choice had been the choice to weaponize his history, when I had been 19, after I had a difficult 3 months of my own. I want to tell you about the year I was 19, because the story does not work without it. I had been a sophomore in college. My grandmother Maeve had died, I had been told at the time, although in retrospect I think now my mother had told me Maeve had died years before she actually had. My mother had told me, when I was 19, that Maeve had passed quietly in Ireland and had asked not to be told about funeral arrangements. I had grieved a grandmother I had barely known. I had also had a serious anxiety episode that had been building for a while, triggered by the loss, the academic pressure, the breakup of a long relationship, and the cumulative weight of years of small things I had been not addressing. I had ended up in a hospital for 10 days. I had been put on medication. I had been given a careful treatment plan. I had returned to school after a semester off. I had stabilized within about 6 months. I had been, by every clinical measure, fine. What I had not known, at the time, was that my mother had used those 3 difficult months to permanently change the family's understanding of who I was. She had told my aunts, she had told my cousins, she had told my grandmother on my father's side. She had told them all the same thing. She had told them very gently that she was so sorry, but it appeared that I had inherited my biological father's instability. She had told them I was showing the same signs he had shown at 25. She had told them, sadly, that we had been worried this might happen. She had told them that the family needed to be careful with me going forward, and that decisions might need to be made about my long-term care, including financial decisions. My grandmother on my mother's side had left me a trust fund of $1.2 million when she had died, when I had been 7. The trust fund had been designed to mature when I turned 25, with smaller distributions allowed earlier for education and medical needs. The trust had been managed by my mother and father as the trustees until I came of age. 3 weeks after I had been discharged from the hospital, my mother had called the family lawyer and had requested an emergency modification of the trust. She had cited my recent hospitalization. She had cited my biological father's history. She had argued that I was not in a position to safely manage that amount of money, that there was a real risk of harm to myself, and that for my own safety the trustees should be granted expanded discretionary authority, including the ability to redirect funds for family wellness purposes. The lawyer had agreed. He had been the family lawyer for 30 years. He had trusted my mother. The modification had been approved. Over the next 7 years, my parents had quietly drained the trust. They had used it for a series of family wellness expenses that had benefited primarily themselves: a vacation home in Maine, a boat, 2 new cars, a renovation of their kitchen, a series of small, unexplained transfers to my mother's personal account. By the time I had turned 26 and the trust had matured, the balance had been roughly $400,000. My mother had presented this to me as if it had been the original amount. She had told me I should be very grateful. She had told me they had been careful with it on my behalf. She had asked me gently, given my history, whether I wanted them to continue to manage it for me. I had said no. I had taken the $400,000. I had used it to buy a small condo. I had not asked questions because by 26, I had been so used to not asking questions about things involving my parents that I had not thought to. I had also, by 26, fully accepted the family's view of me. I was the fragile one. I was the one who had had a breakdown. I was the one who had to be handled carefully. Family events had been performances. My aunts had asked me at every Christmas whether I was still doing well. My cousins had stopped inviting me to small social gatherings. My father's mother, before she had died, had told me at a family dinner, in a voice she had thought was sympathetic, that she was praying I would not go the way of my biological father. I had been quietly outside my own family for 7 years. I had built my career, and I had built friendships outside the family, and I had built a small chosen family of my own, including my closest friend Ajua Boateng, who had been my best friend since college. But I had never been welcome inside the family the way other people had been. I had been tolerated. I had been monitored. I had been managed. The package from Ireland had arrived after 7 years of being managed. I want to tell you what I did after I read all 86 letters. I called Killian Doyle, the solicitor in Galway, the next morning. He had given me his direct number on the small note in the box. I called him at 6 in the morning my time, which had been 11 in his time on a Wednesday. He answered on the second ring. He told me Maeve had asked him to wait for me to call. He told me Maeve had assumed I would, eventually. He told me he had been ready for me. He told me Bram was alive. He told me Bram was 53 years old. He told me Bram lived in a small house outside Galway, where he worked as an architect with a small local firm specializing in restoring historical buildings. He told me Bram had been in stable condition for over 25 years. He had not had any episodes since he had been 28 years old. He had been a quiet, careful, steady man for most of my life. He had built a life. He had not had a family of his own because he had told Killian repeatedly over the years that he had already had a daughter and that he was not going to have any more children because he was waiting for the daughter he already had to come find him, if she was ever going to. Killian asked me if I would like to come to Ireland. He told me Bram did not yet know I had received the letters. Killian had been instructed by Maeve to contact me first, and only then, with my permission, to tell Bram. Bram had not been told a package had been sent. Bram had not been told his mother had left these instructions. The whole thing had been Maeve's design, executed quietly through her solicitor over the 3 months since her death. I told Killian yes. I told him I would fly out the following weekend. I told him to arrange for me to meet Bram at his small house. I told him I did not need a hotel. I would figure out where to stay. I would handle everything else. I want to tell you about the meeting because the meeting is the part of the story that matters most. I flew to Shannon Airport on a Friday afternoon. I rented a car. I drove 3 hours to Galway. I had Bram's address from Killian. I checked into a small bed and breakfast in the city. I slept badly. I drove out to Bram's small stone house at 10 in the morning on Saturday. The drive was about 30 minutes. The house was on a small road, with green fields on either side and a low stone wall in front. There was a small blue Volkswagen in the driveway. There was a black and white dog sitting on the front step who did not bark when I pulled up. I sat in the rental car for 20 minutes. I want to tell you what I was thinking because the thinking is the part of this I have been trying to articulate for the last year. I was thinking that my entire understanding of who I was had been wrong. I was thinking that the 7 years I had spent being treated as my biological father's clinical inheritance had been built on a story that had been a careful lie. I was thinking that the man who lived in this small house had been writing to me every year for 9 years, with no idea whether I was receiving anything, and had kept writing anyway because he had decided that the writing was his job, regardless of whether anybody on the other end was listening. I was also thinking that my mother had spent 30 years building a version of him that was useful to her. I was thinking about how thoroughly I had accepted that version. I was thinking that I was about to meet a person I had been raised to be afraid of, and that the fear, like everything else I had been raised on, had been a tool that had been built for somebody else's use, not mine. I got out of the car. I walked up to the front step. The dog let me pet him. The front door opened before I reached it. Bram was a tall, thin man with gray hair and the kind of eyes that have spent a long time learning how to be still. He was wearing a green sweater. He had been crying, although he was smiling. He looked exactly like the man in the photograph, 25 years older. He looked like me. He said, "Wren." That was all he said. I said, "Bram." He nodded. He stepped back from the doorway. He let me come into the house. The house was small. It was clean. It had a small kitchen and a small sitting room with a fireplace. There were photographs on the wall. The photographs were all of me. They were photographs at every age. Some I recognized from my own life, some I did not. He had been collecting them somehow over the decades. He had been keeping a record of my life from a great distance. We sat in the sitting room for almost 3 hours. He made tea. I told him about the package. I told him about the 86 letters. I told him I had only just received them. I told him I had been told he had not wanted contact. I told him I was sorry it had taken me so long to come. He told me there was nothing to be sorry for. He told me I had not known. He had figured out eventually that I had not known. He had figured it out, he said, around year 5 of writing the letters, when he had found out, through a cousin of mine who had felt guilty about the family secrets, that I had been told he had not wanted to know me. He had decided, in that 5th year, to keep writing anyway. He had told me, at the small kitchen table in his house in Ireland, that the letters had been for him. He had needed to write them. He had been writing them not just to reach me, but to be the kind of person who was reaching. He had been afraid that, if he had stopped writing, he would have stopped being a father. Even in the small, private way he had still been one. He had decided that being a father, in his case, was a daily practice, not a relationship that required reciprocity. The letters had been the practice. I stayed in Ireland for 3 weeks. I want to tell you that quickly because the 3 weeks were both private and crucial. We talked every day. He showed me his work. He drove me to Maeve's grave. We visited the house where my biological mother, also named Saoirse, had grown up, before she had died in childbirth at 24, leaving a young husband behind who had been 25 and unprepared. We visited the small institution where Bram had spent 18 months recovering. He told me what it had been like. He told me he had not been hospitalized for any episode in 25 years. He told me his life was small, but real, and he had built it carefully. I returned to Boston with a different understanding of my own family. The summer family reunion was 3 months after my return. The reunion was at my aunt's lake house in New Hampshire. My mother had organized it the way she had every year for 15 years. She had assumed I would attend, the way I had every year for 15 years. She had assumed I would be quiet, the way I had been quiet every year for 7 years. She had not known about Ireland. She had not known about the letters. She had not known about the wooden box. I drove to the lake house with Bram in the passenger seat. I want to tell you about that drive because the drive was the 4 hours during which I figured out what I was going to do. Bram had been afraid of the reunion. He had been afraid for me more than for himself. He had spent 26 years not being part of my family. He had not been sure he was ready to be in the same room with his sister. I had told him, in the kitchen of his house in Ireland the week before, that I was not asking him to be ready. I was asking him to be present. I was telling him I needed him in the room. The work of facing my mother was going to be mine. The presence of him was going to be the proof. He had agreed. He had flown to Boston. He was sitting in the passenger seat of my car. He was holding the wooden box on his lap, the same wooden box his mother had sent me, with the 86 letters still inside. I want to tell you what happened at the lake house because the happening is the climax of the story. I walked in through the front door at noon. Bram was still in the car. I had asked him to wait. The reunion was already in full swing. There were maybe 40 people. My mother was in the kitchen organizing the food. My father was on the porch talking to my uncle. My cousins were on the lawn with their children. My aunt was setting up the long table on the patio. My mother saw me come in. She smiled the smile she had been smiling at me for 7 years. The smile that meant she was glad I had been brave enough to come. The smile that managed me. I walked over to her. I kissed her on the cheek. I said, "Mom, can you gather the family? I have something I want to show everybody before lunch." She looked at me. The smile faltered briefly. She had been managing me for 7 years, but she had been doing it on the assumption that I was the same person I had been at 19. The me in front of her was different. She could see it. She did not know yet what was different. She gathered the family. It took her about 10 minutes. By 12:15, the entire reunion had been assembled in the large, open living room of the lake house. There were maybe 35 of us. My mother, my father, my aunt and uncle, my cousins and their children, the older relatives, the ones who had been told for 7 years that I had inherited my biological father's instability. I stood at the front of the room. I had the wooden box on a small table beside me. I had a folder of trust fund records I had pulled, with help from a forensic accountant my friend Ajwa had recommended over the previous 2 months. I had 3 of the letters in my hand, the 3 I had selected to read aloud. I want to tell you what I said. I will try to remember it the way I said it. I said, "I want to thank everybody for coming today. I have been part of this family for 26 years. For the last 7 of those years, the family has had a particular understanding of me. The understanding has been that I had a breakdown when I was 19, and that the breakdown was the beginning of a pattern, and that the pattern came from my biological father, who was a person you had been told had been mentally unstable, who had been institutionalized, and who had not wanted contact with me. The understanding has shaped how this family has treated me for 7 years. I have been the fragile one, the one who had to be managed, the one who could not be trusted with the trust fund my grandmother left me. I want everybody in this room to know that the understanding has been wrong. Every single piece of it has been wrong." The room got very quiet. My mother started to speak. I held up my hand. "I am going to read 3 letters," I said. "I am going to read them in chronological order. They are letters my biological father has been sending me for the last 9 years. The letters were intercepted every single time by my mother. She wrote 'returned' on each one in her own handwriting and remailed them back to Ireland. I have 86 of them. I read them all 4 months ago. I read 3 letters. The first was from when I had been 19, sent to my old college address. The second was from when I had been 23. The third was from when I had been 27 a year ago. The letters got progressively quieter. The third letter was the one in which Bram had written that he had figured out the family had told me he was unstable, and that he had decided to keep writing anyway, because it had been the only way he had known how to be a father. I finished reading. The room was silent. My mother was crying. My father was looking at the floor. I said, "I want to introduce somebody." I walked out to the car. He has been waiting in the car outside. He carried the wooden box. He is going to come in now. We came back into the living room together. The family looked at him. I said, "This is my father, Bram O'Sullivan. He has been a quiet, recovered, steady man for 25 years. He is an architect. He restores historical buildings in Galway. He has been writing me letters every year since I turned 18. He has been reaching, in the only way he has been allowed to reach, for 9 years. The version of him that this family has been told about does not exist. The version of him that has existed has been kept from me on purpose." Bram did not say anything. He stood next to me. He held the wooden box. I held up the folder. I said, I also have in this folder the records of my grandmother's trust fund, the trust she left me when I was 7. The trust was $1.2 million. I have been told for 7 years that it was $400,000. The other $800,000 was used by my parents, with the trustee modification they obtained while I was still in recovery from a hospitalization for personal expenses, a vacation home in Maine, a boat, 2 cars, a kitchen renovation, wire transfers to my mother's personal account. I have all of the records. The room was completely silent. My mother was crying harder now. She was looking at me. She finally said in a voice I had never heard her use before, "Wren, please, please forgive us." 3 words. I want to tell you what I did with those 3 words because they are the part of the story that has stayed with me the longest. I turned to Bram, who was standing next to me. I said very quietly so that only he could hear, "Bram, I am not the person who is owed those words. You are. She has been waiting 26 years to apologize to you, and she does not know yet that she should have been apologizing to you the entire time. She is using me as a way to apologize to you without having to look at you. I want you to look at her now. I want her to look at you. I want her to say those words to you. The first apology in this family is owed to you. You are the one who has been carrying the weight she put down." Bram nodded. He stepped forward. He looked at his sister. He said, "Saoirse, look at me." She looked at him. She had not looked at him in 25 years. They had been in the same room 3 or 4 times in those years, at funerals, at small obligatory gatherings, and she had always managed to not look directly at him. He had let her. He had not pressed. He had been doing his quiet work in Ireland. She looked at him now. He said, "I do not need you to apologize to me. I need you to apologize to her. To the version of her you decided to invent when she was 19, instead of asking her who she actually was. To the 7 years she lost being your child instead of mine. Apologize to her. I will live with what you did to me. She does not have to live with what you did to her. Apologize to her, in front of all of these people, and I will go back to Ireland and I will not bother you again. But the apology is hers, not mine." My mother turned to me. She was sobbing now. The whole room was watching. She tried to find words. She did not find them at first. She tried again. She finally said, "Wren, I am so sorry. I have been so afraid. I am so sorry." I said, "Thank you, Mom." I did not say anything else. I did not forgive her in that moment. I did not refuse to forgive her either. I did the only honest thing I could do, which was to acknowledge what she had said and to leave it there, in the air, in the living room, in front of everybody, without resolving it. The reunion ended early. People left, awkwardly, with their casserole dishes. By 2 in the afternoon, only my parents, Bram, and I were left in the lake house. Bram and I left soon after. I drove him back to Boston. He flew home to Ireland the next day. I want to tell you what has happened in the year since, because the year